Welcome to Complexity Medicine, Align and Design. Align and Design is an interactive group discourse, discussion, and dialogue whereby we seek to mutually explore and create a shared pattern language and an implied design thinking process as it relates to health design, leadership, implementation, and integration. Join us as we seek to understand and apply primary patterns and first principles of engagement in the development of systems of care, connection, as well as means towards physiological and ecological well-being at scale. I am artist Andy McClure, and this is Dr. William Sutherland, your hosts.
Today, I'm going to launch it. I'm going to hand it over to Andy as the setting us into motion.
Thanks, Bill. Welcome everybody. I'm really glad that you could join us. If you join us for the first time, and if you're joining us again, that's awesome. I appreciate and value the time that you're giving to spend with us, and I hope we can honor that, because it's really important for us. Bill gave me the task of taking some notes and just to sort of talk a little bit about the conversation last or 2 Thursdays ago. So I sort of thought about it as rounding the circle. And, we gathered around this digital fire to tell stories, and the starting point at the last one was the question about what is health. And that's sort of where we're always going to begin. And we're always going to begin with these questions, and hopefully we'll end with questions as well. And, of course, Bill told us in as part of his conversation that the word health comes from the word whole. And anytime you ask a question that has both answers and questions within it, you create something really interesting. It has a kind of a life of its own, a kind of strange paradoxical loop, right? Because when something's whole, it's always whole. And even if we're only noticing or seeing or framing or naming parts of it, it is what it is. So it was kind of strange and beautiful and different when out of that question, we had some really interesting answers. I think Catherine, our university student, noted that good balanced systems have feedback loops that create their own emergent and transformative methods of balance. Health is adaptive and responsive. It's an adaptive and responsive system. And in art, we call that the infinite possibilities of composition. There's not really an answer in composition. There's only a rearranging of parts to create new forms of dynamics. And the point of that is always to create some sort of dynamic stability, whatever that means. And I was pleased as an artist that we got to discuss patterns on the blanket and wallpaper and other forms. That was nice. But we also were given some stories that pointed to difficult conversations. We heard Adam's story about silkworms, and it started with discovery and wonder and birth, and some elements of control, and then ended with a kind of disaster and chaos and loss, which doesn't seem at first glance to make sense that it's going to connect with, how does that connect with our initial question? And we heard the story of explaining to children the significance of such difficult concepts as the residential school system. Alex, I think, talked about that. And most of us know the story of Phyllis Webstead and how she had her shirt taken from her at the first day of residential school, that orange shirt. And it was, of course, given to her by her grandmother. And the story was powerful because the story is one of loss. And it was the loss of innocence of this young girl, but it was also the loss of innocence of the storyteller who was trying to relate this, heavy story to a group of children. And of course, orange shirt is, we think of orange as being this color of the sun, of joy and of beauty. And that, is kind of poignant in that loss. We also sort of note that it was something that was given to her by her grandmother. And so we noted that the story was not just a simple story of transaction, but of handing down. The shirt represented much more than just simply a piece of clothing, but a part of a tradition and history and relationship that was broken. And so again, that is an interesting place to come to for the initial question of what is health? We're so accustomed to looking at the idea of health at its endpoint that we sometimes forget we have to honor and give space to that struggle from which that difference, which we know as health, is realized. And Bill noted that we used to tell children difficult stories. Much of our, those of you who are old enough who grew up with nursery rhymes and such at night know as adults that they were often quite gory and visceral. And as children, we don't think about Rockabye Baby in the treetop. When the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall. What a crazy thing to say to your child just before they're going off to sleep. But now we use terms like resilience, and my grandmother used to say it was a little sugar with the medicine. That the stories were medicine. The story I told you before you go to sleep, this is medicine. And maybe she knew that dreams were a safe place in which to enact a kind of calibration for ourselves, right? To know that struggle. Recently, Bill was talking about, I'm not sure, maybe he can elucidate the story a little better, but of how at one point in our history, we went to bed at the end of the day grateful that we had made it to the end of the day. And we woke up in the morning and we opened our eyes grateful that we were awake because we had woken up, because we had survived the night, because we had survived the day. And so there was gratitude in our eyes and in our hearts upon waking. Now we just have the expectation that we're always going to be fine, that everything's going to be fine, that everything's going to be okay, great. This is an example of a story that I heard once, and I love it, and I probably will not tell it correctly, and I believe it's a Northwest Coast story, but I remember the first time that I heard it and thinking that this is quite gory. But the story was essentially of this big bird, and the children were told that if they went into the forest, that this bird was going to come down and attack them. And it would literally, land on their heads and crush their heads and devour them. And of course, as the stories always are, one of the kids goes out into the forest because we always have to have this moment of struggle and of loss. And so the child goes out into the forest and of course encounters this bird who then attacks the child. And the parent is so distraught and angry over this that as she goes in search of this bird for vengeance, and ends up going to the edge of a lake and climbing out on a branch so that her reflection is reflecting in the water. And when the bird sees her, flies down and of course mistakes the reflection for her and drowns in the lake. And she's so filled with anger that she, pulls the bird from the lake and brings it back and throws it in the fire to burn it. And as it burns, it breaks all apart into these small little bits, ashes. And those ashes become mosquitoes. And that's the birthplace of mosquitoes. And I always loved the totality of that story, of how that story held all of these things in it, all these sufferings and pains and tragedies, but also this completeness to it. There's a story within it that holds bigger stories. And I guess that was what was so lovely about our first conversation, was that out of that question about what is health came some interesting stories that at first glance don't seem as if they answer that question, but of course they come around to it in really beautiful ways, which I think is sort of where we're starting today with how we come around to things. Bill? Of course, I'll never know if he can hear me.
There you go.
And if not, yeah,
the delay of virtual time, which we'll find. And when we
I can dance.
you could, but then you'd be taking a job away from Alex. And what would he feel? Thank you, Andy. As to where to start. And I
forgot to talk about.
Oh, you're frozen on us, Andy. So I will
suspense.
I will jump in here. In terms of my starting position today in the talk, and I want to say something a little aside. Actually, I want to start with expressing the feeling of gratitude, because one thing is I'm looking at all your faces on the screen here, and again, it seems so distant, and I get it. It's alienated in the Zoom age and all of these things. But I really do feel that as everybody here is returned and I see some new faces, I really do feel that the spirit of like when I see your faces, it feels supportive. And I love that. I'm grateful for that supportive feeling in this endeavor, in this project, and that it doesn't feel transactional. It doesn't feel mercantile. It feels that we are here to support each other as we question and try to figure out, what is this notion called health, and how do we move into it? And so let me just start with that gratitude. And then before we hit the record button, as we were just gathering, my friend Eric here we were just mentioning the passing of his teacher, a great osteopathic physician, James Jealous. And Eric mentioned about the nature of after a lifetime of that work, the state of authenticity that he arrived at in his being, and that was felt by everybody in his presence. And he arrived at that authenticity, like Eric also mentioned, by chasing his wonderment to be present in whoever was in front of him, was whoever was under his hands, or wherever he was in the world at the time. And so we see his authenticity, and we see the exemplar nature of wonderment in his life. And so as we're here today, I think, that over time, this gathering, this work in whatever small way this is becomes part of the bigger picture of our lives. That in some ways, how do we navigate with that wonderment towards that type of authenticity? So since I left you 2 weeks ago, I've had a chance to reflect on 2 weeks ago. And that's the starting point for me today. And I'm going to start with a surprising. We'll move into how, what today is different from last time. But I want to start with sort of a surprising reflection, which when I look back 2 weeks ago on when we initiated this endeavor, whatever this is going to be called, Align and Design, whatever this notion of health design thinking will become, whatever we're developing as a community. I realized that last week, and you'll be shocked by this word, but it will come around. So just hold it for a second. That I engaged in a necessary sin. Sin is the word. And as it was a specific sin, it was the sin of pride. The sin of pride. And so what do I mean by that? Well, how does one start anything? How do we move into something? That in some sense I needed the momentum that pride offered. The belief that I had something to offer. That the notion that I needed to stand on some foundation of expertise. Perhaps a kind of arrogance to think that this could succeed. And so it was a useful sin, pride, 2 weeks ago to get this started. I don't know if I would have started it at this point in my life without my pride. But here's the thing. I want less of my pride this week. And I want less of my pride as this moves along. And so that journey towards seeing that pridefulness fall away is interesting. So this notion of sin. When you look at the etymology of the word, though, it's a really interesting etymology. Sin comes from a word that comes from the Hebrew. And it was an archery term. It was that you were off target, that you had missed the mark. And that was noted to be a sin. It was just a statement of being off target. And you think in terms of as the Jewish people, the Hebrew people being a military tribe, that they had archers, they went to war, target was important, but they were also a nomadic people who walked from place to place. And so again, when you're walking, you need to walk on target. You have to orient yourself. You have to calibrate yourself as to where you're going with the direction. I had a funny thing just the other day. I was out snowshoeing and I was following coyote trails. And I was thinking, what are these crazy coyotes doing? There's nothing straight line about it. They meander here, they wander there, they circle there. What are these crazy coyotes up to? Where are they going? What kind of madness is this? Thinking that I'm walking straight. But the nice thing about snowshoes is they leave a big track, a big imprint behind. And so I walked somewhere and then I turned around to walk back. And the moment that I turned around to walk back, I saw my crazy tracks. I'm moving to the left. I'm moving to the right. I'm going off track. I'm going off. I'm sinning often on my wanderings. And in my mind, I was walking a straight line. So this notion of sin. So what is that then? Why point to it? Well, it's a chance to calibrate, right? So the idea of it is that if you're off target, how do you get on to target? So when we started 2 weeks ago, I respectfully say, of course, we had to sin. We took an arrow and we shot it into the air with no idea of where it was going or where it would land. That's a beginning. And to remember, we don't know what this whole thing, this align and design program is becoming. We don't understand yet what health design thinking is. We don't know how we will evoke and create change in our lives, in our family lives, in the community, or in the world as a whole. We don't know, right? So what can you do in the face of that huge not knowing? Well, you shoot an arrow into the air and you see where it lands, and you see if it brings you closer or further away from whatever this notion is called health. And that's a useful thing. If it's further away, we learn something. If it's closer, we learn something. How do we gauge it? How do we analyze it? How do we see what that shot, was it true or was it not? And we learn that as we go along. It's part of the process itself. And so even the process of, is my shot true or not, has to be learned and calibrated as we go along. It's internal and circular within the process. So there was a couple things that I thought that I would recalibrate from last time. And one of those ones was to add in a complexity concept each time. And one was to reiterate the methodology of what we're doing here with this align and design work. So the methodology point today is that this is what we call a complexity-based learning. So there's two parts to that. We have to understand what the metaphor of complexity is, which we don't have yet. You didn't have to read the book before you came. We're going to learn it as we go along. And then rather than just knowing terminologies and names and the naming of these complexities, we have to go one step forward to make it a learning. And we have to enact these complexities in the relationship of this time together. So part of this learning is what we call, or I'm calling, a complexity-based learning, right? It's going to be different than other types of learnings because we are going to learn what those metaphors are and then model them in the living relationship. So to start us on that, I just want to introduce one word today that goes with the story. And that story and that word, that complexity term today that I would like to work on is that called is iteration. This word iteration. And it has lots of other words that goes with it. Circularity, feedback loops. But you'll see that there's other words that are associated with it. Like I spoke of calibration, how we get to the target through successive actions and harvesting the results of those actions. So what an iterative action is that we put an input into the system. We have a start. We shoot the arrow. We see where it lands. And then we take that output, that understanding, that learning, that harvest, just like Andy did from last week, and we circle it around as our new starting point. That's the iterative learning cycle. And we do it again and again and again, over and over, around and round. We turn that wheel, we turn that circle, we go about. So iteration holds this notion where we started of this etymologically ancient term, interesting term, sin. This idea of calibration. Another thing you'll hear us speak, you've heard me speak of Gregory Bates, and today I'm going to speak of Heinz von Forster, of this notion of a school of complexity called Cybernetics. It comes from an ancient Greek word, kybernetes. It means the oarman or the navigator in a boat, right? That act of navigation, right? Of ruddering, right? So that you have this idea of where you're heading, a target. Maybe at first you don't even have that. Maybe you're just at sea, but at some point you have a sense of where you're going with direction. And then moment by moment, left, right, back, forward, dealing with all the elements as we can. We navigate. We have these ideas of feedback. You have this in your very home. This is the nature of biology lives on this. You have a thing called a thermostat. If you know how a thermostat works on bringing back to a constraint and a set point, you understand negative feedback. If you've ever seen an avalanche, how a snowball becomes an avalanche, you understand what amplification and positive feedback is. Iteration brings about notions of convergence and divergence. Either it's going to bring us to a solid unity, autonomy, a point, or it's going to scatter and become unsustainable, right? Convergence, divergence. A little exercise that's worth doing. If anybody has a phone right now, take your phone, grab the calculator function, Just try a little experiment if you have it right there. Pull up the calculator. Put in any number that you would like. Any number. As big as you can fit onto that calculator. And just keep hitting the square root button over and over. This is an iterative act where the output of that square root function becomes the new beginning and becomes the input. And just iteratively hit that function called square rooting over and over any number. You will all have started with different numbers. And tell me which number you end up with. Do it over and over until it comes to a convergence where you can't do it anymore. What does it end up at? Just hitting the square root again and again and again on whatever the output is.
Mine says bad expression.
That's awesome. Sometimes we end up with a bad expression. Did it work for anybody? Maybe you need an old-fashioned calculator to do it. So if you keep square rooting any number over and over, it will end up at 1. Now, it's probably not a true one. It's probably a rounding error, and life is full of rounding errors. But you're going to end up in the stability or the vicinity called 1. Did it work for you, Greg? I see you putting it up there. There it is, 1, right? Yeah, there it is. And so that's an example of an iterative experience. Right now, we're starting off on whatever this random number is. We've named it Align in Design. We've named it this, but we're just out there, right? We're just out there. And every time we come back together, it's like hitting the square root. And over time, we're going to get closer and closer to this unity and this target and this calibration as we look to answer this thing, what is health, right? As we look to answer it. We'll come closer to it. This is the iterative function. This is what it means to become a human being over your lifetime. When a child is born fresh into the world, day 1, moment 1, there is this living organism there, but there's not yet a self, right? From that very first breath, that very first moment in the world, the iterative process starts, right? How, here's an exposure, here's an input, here's an output, here's a learning, here's an input, output, cycled back, here's a learning. And we circle around every moment of our life in an iteration. And eventually we become a self, a person, right? We discover our personhood. And interesting, at some point, sometimes that personhood is confining, right? Sometimes that personhood is a bit of a prison. Sometimes part of later life, and maybe some of the reasons you're here, is to break that conformity of one, back into other possibilities, into a new whole, a new one. But iteration, you can't escape it. Circularity, you can't escape it in living beings. And so that's the lesson today on iteration and feedback. And we'll go back to this in many, many ways, but that's the complexity concept I want you to start to hold, put it on the wall. We'll start to arrange it over time. All right. So here is the other one, I'll talk more about it later, but the notion of our koan, right? That paradoxical question, questions that create great doubt, questions that produce, continuous answers, that the importance of questions that are meant to be held. Last week was the primary koan, and it will be in every single session we come together. What is health? What is health? What is health? It's here today. It will be here every time. But under that primary umbrella, we'll introduce these new koans. And today is by a mentor and friend and brother named Bradford Keeney. And he's a great cybernetic thinker among many things. And the one that I want to add, that I want to bring out today, that he brought out and will be the focus of today, is this notion of act to know versus know to act. And I would suggest that the common mode of the modern society is this idea that you have to know first, and then you can do something. That once you have a knowledge, you'll know what the right action is. And today we're going to put that on its head and say the wisdom more often than not in life is actually the opposite. We have to create an action to know. And if that starts to resonate with the notion of iteration and the notion of shooting the arrow and my redefining this idea of sin, right? Of calibration, of getting on target, already you'll start to see act to know. I'm going to start us off with a few quotes, just like last time. And I want you to see the notion of action. And these are all from a great cybernetic thinker named Hein van Forster. Last week, I introduced you to Gregory Bateson. And Heinz von Forster had he always was coming up with his own koans. He called his koans imperatives. So this was his ethical imperative. Act always so to increase the number of choices. Act always so as to increase the number of choices. He called that his ethical imperative. His aesthetic imperative. If you want to see, learn how to act. If you want to see, learn how to act. Heinz von Forster's aesthetic imperative. And this last one was his change imperative. I like this. It will strike you as a difficult one, I think. If you want to be yourself, change. If you want to be yourself, change. That's Heinz von Forster's change imperative. And lastly, this one doesn't speak to action directly, but I think it's part of our shifting. And he notes, objectivity is a subject's delusion that observing can be done without him. Involving objectivity is abrogating responsibility, hence its popularity. Let me just say that one more time. Objectivity is a subject's delusion that observing can be done without him. Involving objectivity is abrogating responsibility, hence its popularity. This is all recorded. You can go back and listen, and we'll write these out, of course, and you'll have a chance to reflect on it. And my final quote, and I'll just send it back to Andy, for a response, and then we'll open it up to the group. I've just discovered Buckminster Fuller in my life recently, and I love the Bucky quotes that it comes forward. And this one I love because I think it is the heart of act to know. He says, I live on earth at present, and I don't know what I am. I know that I'm not a category. I am not a thing, a noun. I seem to be a verb, an evolutionary process, an integral function of the universe. So take a second, take it in, act to know. Start to feel the reverberations of that bowstring as it shoots the arrow in your own heart, in your own mind, in your own experience, in your own storytelling, where the truth of act to know was your guidance, your momentum, your creativity, and your way out of inertia and stuckness. Act to know. I'm going to give it back to Andy for a moment and of reflection, and then we're going to open this one up to the group for story and conversation and dialogue and discourse.
Thanks, Phil. Okay. I just want to tell a couple stories. That's where I come in. The first one is just rounding the corner from last week. So 30 years ago or so, Mrs. Sume gave Bill some silk. Bill was studying in Japan and learning a type of healing known as Seikijutsu. And Bill, in working with me, passed on some of that silk to me, probably 15, 20 years ago. And I have had that and have that silk onto Olga, who is one of my students and is here tonight. And recently we were talking to Olga about Seiki and that Japanese form. And she asked about the silk And Bill and I both said, well, funny enough, Adam talked about silk in our last conversation, and it came up. And sort of thinking about how that thing has shown up. I mean, I think it's important that it showed up, that a teacher passed on something, that a teacher made a choice to do something, to pass something. And Bill, in teaching me this, made a choice, made a decision to do something, to pass on something. And I, in turn, made a choice to pass on something. And in a way, Adam's story that the first week was a choice to tell that particular story. He couldn't have known that it was connected to a line going back much older than us and our circle of stories. But it was this, the silk was a relation, a kind of visceral, embodied feeling. Putting your hands on it and feeling it, you can feel its pattern, its web, its intricacy, its fragility and its toughness, its relational dynamics. And it's so, as a metaphor and as a real thing, it holds that very beautifully. And of course, coming around now, Olga owning a smaller and smaller bit of this, will have to decide what to do with that, because that is the nature of the circularity, is that these actions create responses, and these responses create interesting patterns, and these interesting patterns then we can decide to build on and to grow and to support, or to break into new things. But it sets up the possibilities for things to show themselves. So I want to tell the story. A few years ago, I was coming home with my daughters, and we pulled into the driveway, and there was a car, a stranger's car in our driveway. And I didn't know who it was, so we live in the country. I asked the girls just to wait in the car, and I got out, and it was a woman that I had met a few years ago, and she was having a very rough time. And she had driven from the United States without a cell phone and without a passport to my house. Somehow she got through the border without showing a passport, and somehow she made it to my house. More by luck than by anything else. She had an address, and she followed the general direction. And I live in the middle of nowhere. So anyway, we sat out on the grass. I have a pond, and we sat on the edge of the hill, and we talked. And she was struggling and having a very difficult time, and she'd come for a conversation. And so after talking and making good progress, invited her, and she came in and had dinner, and then invited her to stay over, and she stayed over in my daughter's room, and my daughter graciously gave up her room. And in the morning, I went downstairs and I made some breakfast, and I went up and I knocked on her door, and there was no answer. And so I figured she was sleeping, and I waited, and I went back up and knocked on the door. Still no answer. I was a little worried now. So I opened the door, and she wasn't there. Car was still in the driveway, but she wasn't there. So I waited about half an hour, and then I figured that she had gone. We live in a forest, so I figured that she had gone out into the forest. So I went out into the forest to look for her, and I found her. And she was only about 20 minutes away from the house, but she was lying on her back on the ground, and she was holding this full set of deer antlers on her chest like this. And she said, "Oh, you found me." And I said, yes. I said, "What happened?" And she said, "I got lost. I came out and I got lost, but I found these." Now, I've lived here for more than 22 years, I've never found antlers on my property. And here she had found these antlers. And I said, so I see. And she sort of said, no, but like I found these antlers. And I said, no, these antlers, aren't these antlers what you were looking for? You know, aren't they the map that you were looking for? You know, doesn't this make sense to you? And it suddenly made sense to her. It suddenly made sense how this was what she was looking for. And it was such a beautiful, there was nothing that I did to invoke any of that other than conversation and food and a bed. And there's nothing really that she did except that she acted out of desperation, response, need, and she got lost. And somehow in the process of acting and being lost, there was a new find, a new discovery. And she left that afternoon with the antlers in the back of the car and made it back to the States. And and now we both have this amazing story to tell. But I think it really does, like, it is kind of what we're talking about and what Bill's talking about, how, you know, we don't really know. We shoot at the mark, but we don't really know what the mark is. And we only calibrate as we go along. But there is a moment in which the composition shows itself. There is a moment in which health shows itself. There is a moment in which being lost is suddenly being found. And part of this process is that really trusting that you don't have to know, and you just have to pay attention. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Andy. That's lovely. Yeah. And I want to open up to our stories now, our broader stories as a group, and start to weave these silk threads that Adam's silkworms 2 weeks ago, and how many years before that. Adam, how old were you when that story started, Adam? That the silkworm story, how many years ago was that?
Well, I must have been 9 or 10, and my brother was about 7.
And you're now, how many years? So how many years would that be roughly?
Oh boy, about 50 some. Well, actually, slightly less than 50 years.
Yeah. So here we go, right? A story of worms that started weaving a thread 50 years ago. Let's continue on that thread and pick up these threads as they come together. So I want to give you a little something to organize where you go forward with your action in tonight. So 2 triads, they're essentially the same, but they're slightly different metaphors. So the 3 I's. Act to know. Remember, this is all around acting to know. So we can act with our intellect, we can act with our intuition, and we can act with our instinct, right? Intellect, intuition, instinct, 3 I's. Act to know. Similar metaphor. We can act with the head, we can act with the heart, and we can act with the gut. Act to know. Now, sometimes there's a unity where you can act with all 3. Consensus in your being. That's a lovely moment when that comes together. But I say you don't need consensus to act. All you need is quorum. 2 out of 3. Head and heart and gut, head and gut. Problem is the head will tell you it has all 3 votes. So just know that ahead of time. Screws it up. It only gets 1. It doesn't get 3. So I just want to kick it off. I want to do something a little usual. Normally, I just let the freedom. Normally, this is our second session. The freedom of everybody to chip in. But I actually want to come back to Eric. Eric, I want to kind of put you on the spot because I know we both have a shared love of this art called osteopathy. And in one ways, what I would say that traditional osteopathy, when we look at the orthodox medicine that we're of the West, which I love, by the way. I am an MD. Eric is a DO. I love medicine, but if we look at its form, the modern medical form is very much know to act, right? We learn and we understand the theory and all of that knowledge base such that we can go out into the world to do something. And again, as we go back to James Jellison in this moment, in his passing, we recognize this. I'm going to propose that osteopathy very much in the traditional sense was act to know. And I just wonder if you can share that sense of, sure, the person could come in and say, hey, you know, my knee's the problem, my back's the problem, this is the problem. But for in that spirit of acting to know what it's like to put a hands onto somebody in a not knowing, such that it takes you into that process.
Oh, thank you, Bill. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that does remind me of some conversations I've had with, say, Dr. Jealous in the past. So I think the first thing that I could share with you is something he said to me a long time ago, which is going to lead into something else. And he said, you know, we start off in this kind of intellectual education, which was, you know, medical education or science-based education. And then that kind of begins your practice. And then if you have a person who like decides to experiment or be interactive, then you have an instinct, right? So the instinctual part comes in. And as time goes by and you learn more and you get more connected with people and you get more connected with the process, then it becomes more of intuition, you know, whereas the past, it's not guesswork, it's past and experience. And he goes, and then at one point we have to let all of that go and act from wisdom, right? So it's not an exclusion. We don't exclude intellect or we don't exclude instinct, right? They're equal partners and at the same time subservient to this overall interaction, which loses the concept of anatomy, right? We don't think about, I'm going to touch the back or I'm going to touch the leg or the nose. We touch the person, and the person is whole and complete. And when you touch their back or you touch their knee, you're touching the whole person and every part of that person at the same time. So I think that might kind of work alongside what you're discussing here. You know, the idea of different levels of interaction, different ways of being in interaction.
So this is perfect, Eric. On two notes that I just want to bring forward, and I really want everybody to hear what Eric said, right? So acting to know is not an abstract process. It's an interactive process. It's a contextual process. It's a whole process, right? So all of those words that we're beginning to understand are beginning to have inklings of journeying into, you know, what is this thing of wholeness, right? So interaction, right, is so important. Context, right? Embracing the wholeness of them, of you, the moment that holds you, the history that has brought you. So don't miss these things, because this is the terrain now, right? This is the texture. And he used remember last week, or 2 weeks ago, I referred to that capital words: health, beauty, love, sacred, holy, wisdom. The words we can speak around and towards, but never directly of, or else we'll create a profanity or a pathology, right? We speak of health reverently, not flippantly. We speak around it, about it, because we can't ever grasp it. It's a holism. So thank you, Eric. That's beautiful. And you just took it into now how you've helped us now. We're all to step into this interaction. So let's open it up to all of you. The hands up, acting to know, moving from one of these places. Just start anywhere. The intellect, the intuition, the instinct. We'll challenge you to move beyond it.
So Nicola has her hand up.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, I just really like this conversation a lot. And the acting to know part for me just takes me right into the garden. And I'm someone that works a lot with plants and growing them. And so to step into the garden and step into the presence of plants, and specifically medicinal plants, it kind of like melds this understanding, this intellect of understanding of what the plants do and how they act in our bodies and how they have different constituents and how those constituents are broken down in different ways and made bioavailable in different ways. And then to actually go and sit with a plant and experience the feeling. And I have a really great experience the first time I did this really intentionally with oats. And I went into the garden and I planted like a nice patch of oats. And I went and sat in the oats in like an intentional way of like visiting them and feeling, what is this medicine? And I know it's good medicine for our nervous system. I'm told it's good medicine for our nervous system. And so to like go in and sit with the oats was such an incredible experience the first time I did this, because I sat there and immediately it's like the smell of like kind of damp soil and rich soil, and it smells good and like just that good garden feel anyway. But then to sit with the oats specifically, they all have like their heads kind of dangle down, the seed heads. And it was just like a little bit of a wind that day. And the seed heads were like kind of rubbing against the stalk. And listening, it makes this sound where the oats are singing or speaking, or like the sound they make in the wind is shh. And it's this beautiful, comforting, soothing, relaxing sound. And just that alone, like there was like more to the experience, but that alone was like, oh, like I get who you are and how you work so much more. So those conversations kind of reminded me of that day and being in the garden in general and connecting in that intuitive or sort of sensory way. So yeah, just wanted to share that.
Olga, do you have a story about plantain?
Not a specific story, but whenever we in the summers when we were kids, we used to go biking a lot with and we used to have a park by our house, and we'd go there, and we as kids obviously would fall a lot, and we'd get scratches and stabs and cuts. And my mom would always tell us too, there's this plant growing everywhere. It's called plantain, and she would always tell us to take a leaf and just put it against her wound. And I never knew why. It was just something that we did. And just today I was reading a book and it talked about it and the science, well, not the science behind that, but it kind of validated that this was an actual thing and an actual process. And it does help with wounds and bacteria. So that was just a nice validation.
So, Olga, with that knowledge validation, but you didn't wait to this point in your life to go out and pick a plantain leaf and put it on a wound. Somewhere in your relationship with your mother and your mother's wisdom, you trusted that action. Did you need the validation ultimately? Or would you, if it never had come, would you have gone through the rest of your life still putting that plantain leaf on you?
Yeah, I mean, the validation is more of just a fun thing that there is science behind this. I still trust in it and I still believe in it regardless of that, because it is a wisdom that has existed for arguably much longer than science. And it's just nice to know that it is actually being used.
So we're not anti-science here. I mean, we're always going to go back and reference science. And I think it's important to challenge with science. But there's an important distinction, right? That facts and what is true, what is factual and what is true is not necessarily the same thing, right? And the problem with knowing to act is we'll be stuck with what is factual and limit it in our actions to the factual. But what is true, if I tell you a Grimm's fairy tale or a mythological telling or the dream I had last night or a story that I made up that never happened, it can still very well be true in your experiences in your life, right? So so part of acting to know is that it opens us up to a host of possibilities of truths that in a way that knowing per se is the first action, shuts things, shuts down possibilities. The one thing, Nicola, did people catch it when she made the sound of the oats? Did you feel that? What was the sound, Nicola? It was such a beautiful sound you made in the story. Right? There's a telling, right? Here's an important thing. I'll go back to gardens later, but our job here is to learn to catch each other's story. So when Nicola told her story, when Olga told her story, how do you know you caught it? Is that it evokes a feeling in you, and that feeling may bring up a remembrance, another story, another sharing, a position. And then we can say to Nicola and Olga, see, I caught your story. It brought this up in me, right? We're passing the silk on. Did anybody in hearing their stories feel something? Were they reminded, remembered, remolded into something?
Alexander, hands up.
Yeah.
And then Sebastian.
So in listening to Nicola's story, I was reminded of an experience I had 2 weeks ago now. I was briefly Dr. Bill's patient at the start of the pandemic. And the first prescription he gave me was to take an egg when I ate eggs in the morning and scramble it up and read some kind of meaning into that as a way of reflecting. There's a lot more to it than that, but I suppose that's a good way to put it. And a couple weeks ago, I was scrambling up my egg, and it was just a moment while I was doing it where I saw just the pattern between the yolk and the white, and it looked like a kind of fabric that you were just pulling apart, and it was thin, and it was in like small tendrils just all over the bowl. And that moment, I just felt like moving in that space between the tendrils and just feeling them envelop me. And I feel that kind of the same thing in Nicola's story, where you can just feel the sound of the oats and them moving in the wind and like the seeds rubbing against the stalks. And it's just the same feeling there, where you're moving loosely between the stalks, between the tendrils and the eggs. And it's just a gentle swaying there. Some freedom, some resistance. A nice liminal spot to sit.
Sebastian?
Yeah, I was I don't know why, but a bunch of things came up with the story of the oats. And one of them was last year, again at my school. I was teaching kindergarten, and I was not really happy in my life at this point. It was the fall, it was near winter. Bunch of things were going on. Too much to get into, but I was trying, I guess, to therapize myself with the presence of these kids. Like it would do that to me. It would, if I could catch it, because it's like that too. You can catch it so wrong. It's almost like a wave when you're teaching. And if you have enough energy, the right kind of energy, not the resistant kind, they will give you energy. Like you'll catch what everyone's laughing about in the corners of your eyes, and you'll just catch on, and it'll keep itself going. But this day I was kind of sedated. I felt kind of sedated. I was tired. I was living at my grandpa's at Cambridge, and it was like a 2-hour commute. I was tired. Maybe as a result, I feel like my head was numbed and everything else was maybe coming up more, because that tends to be at least in that year, that was the dominant thing. It was like my head. I was thinking, I was overthinking. I see this so clearly now, but it was my first year knowing that I was doing that and trying to get out of it. Anyways, I kind of halfway through the day, I say, okay, this is a good day. It's going pretty well. But I also felt like if something really intense were to happen, I would probably not handle it that well. And then something really intense did happen. There's another teacher that comes in the afternoon, and she comes in for an hour, and she's not very good with young kids. She doesn't know how to handle them and how to again go with the flow. She tries to get them to sit down, and they go everywhere. And so this is happening in the class. I'm tired. There's kids running around everywhere. And suddenly there's the real problem, which is the youngest kid. He's tiny. Okay. He probably shouldn't even be in kindergarten, but he just, he had an accident, shit his pants. And, he's in the bathroom over there. And he's like, Monsieur, it's a French school. And he's like, can you come over here? He doesn't really speak French though, which is fine. And I'm like, oh, what happened? And I go, and it's a mess. It's one of those horror scenes, and like in movies. and I'm like, I don't know what happened. I could have if my head had been working more, I probably would have gotten mad at him. Honestly, I would have been angry. I would have been. I wasted no time. I just started. It's like what do you call it? A koan. It's like in meditation when you remember what it feels like to lose you're focusing on your breath, and you're like, that's it. And then you just start, I start cleaning him. I start cleaning the bathroom mostly. And meanwhile, outside, there's 20 kids, she was counting on me to take care of them. So I'm being very patient with him. I'm helping him learn how to clean himself. I'm like, how about you now use this here and that? And then I'm running outside, and I'm like, I'm not yelling at the kids or being very strict with them. I go in front, and the teacher's there. She's like, I don't know what to do. I'm like, come, I'll tell you a story. And so I'm telling them the story long enough to get them to settle down. And then I go back into the bathroom, and I help him more, and I go back and forth, and there's craziness happening. But it was like in that moment, I didn't have to focus on the craziness. I could just see all the things that would tie themselves back up if I just I don't know, I just helped people the right way. And it was a weird day, but I remember that one really, really vividly. Yeah. That's it.
Thank you. So thank you.
I know that Bill's going to talk about that one. Go ahead, Bill.
No, you've missed. I do have an obsession with, with all things corporal. But that's just a hazard of being a medical doctor. So I do love it though, because, in a moment when you don't know, here's a nice little summation or possibility. In a moment when you don't know, and you're confronted clearly with, I don't know. Yeah. There's two choices: freeze. And by the way, that is a deep evolutionary wisdom, but that's the kind of not knowing, like you may not survive, right? Like the lion has you in its grip, right? So freeze. Or act. And that action is this vital, primal, creative, full, inspired, coming forth. And what I would say is it's the kind of action that's different. It's not you acting. It's the action that is arising in you, arising forth, coming. And this is this great transition that the practice of action, no, it doesn't always go there. Just act, act, act. And someday you go from the doing to being done. You go from dancing to being danced. You go from painting to being painted. You go from writing to being writ. Like this is, but you don't, that's grace. You don't get to ask for it. You just get to make yourself tender, available. You get to make yourself good bait for the old gods that they'll take an interest in you, and do something. So I love that story. And I want to make sure we get to the hands. Andy, is there anything you want to jump in before I see Olga's and Chris's hands there? Is there?
Yeah, just I think it's really important to sort of keep the thought that, like in Nicola's story, the garden needed her to be there. So there was some healing going on just sitting there, right? Some wisdom teaching of plants teaching, but also there was a reciprocal conversation going on. They needed each other in that. The plantain needs to be picked to be used for cuts and scrapes. In Olga's story, that moment needed to happen. And in Sebastian's story, he says, like, I'm all in my head. Everything is all in my head. I'm here in my head. And I'm thinking about, the Bushmen, the Sand people, have lots of stories around and wisdom around eating and defecating. The idea of putting something in your mouth, chewing it up, digesting it, and transforming it, of the cycle of going from one thing to another so that it can be part of a continuity, a part of a dance, part of a relationship, right? And so in that moment, that young man needed to shit his pants so that you could stop being in your head. And he also needed you to not be in your head so that you could show him at that moment a grace so that he didn't have to feel shame or pain or suffering, but just love. And in between being cared for, you were telling stories. And so for that young person now, their whole encoding of that transformative moment was of care and gentleness and storytelling. And you needed each other in that moment in such a way that neither of you did those things on purpose, but each of you, were a part of it. I just, as Bill's said, when we are catching each other's stories, I want you to always be looking for that other dynamic there, the part how we evoke and invoke each other into those narratives.
I just
Okay, got a couple of questions. Yeah.
You have to unmute yourself, Bill, if you want to talk.
You muted yourself.
Sorry. I muted myself. There's wisdom there. I should have just followed. You should have reminded me. Alex, you know, it's funny when you share the story about reading the whipped eggs. I mean, that's an old story. That's a very old. That's a very old story. It's reading guts, right? It was reading the guts and entrails of chickens, pigs, goats, cows, right? Tea leaves was a sedate, very much covered over glossing of the original reading the guts, right? Reading the liminal, reading the transformative organ such that you could engage the world with your action, right? To move it forward. And, you know, it's funny, you talked about dancing with that space of those gossamer threads with the, in the egg, dancing with that. And how do you dance with a young child who's shite himself? You know, like there's a dance, you know, but I want you to note that there is a movement and a dance that is part of this action. I see, I'm not sure if it was Olga or Chris. How about you guys battle it out as to who goes first there? One of you jump in, followed Olga, by the other.
If I could go back to Nicola's garden and something Bill said at the beginning about nouns and verbs. When you were talking, Nicola, it's funny how our language is so built on nouns. Everything, you describe everything with nouns. Lake, plant, garden. But it doesn't have to be like that. And it doesn't really make sense for it to be like that because none of those things are fixed and none of them are static. And a pond today isn't the same pond it will be tomorrow. And a plant today isn't the same plant it will be tomorrow. So we tend to view ourselves as dynamic beings moving through a static world, but it isn't like that at all. And if you treat things as verbs instead of nouns, then you free them from that static state that they're in, allow them to live just on their own terms. And I think that's interesting.
Olga, I just want to push one thing just slightly into, again, I love you're paying attention to the languaging, right? How do I become more verb-like in my languaging? How do I talk about these in living transformative as processes, not things? That you take the responsibility of your subjectivity and not the popularity of in the modern world of objectivity, as Bucky Fuller said in that quote. I'm going to push you in your telling to use the I position. Don't go to you or we, if it's an actual we, but when you're talking about an I, when I'm in the garden and I see that plant change every day, when I visit the pond and I'm different, it's just a slight thing. And I'm going to encourage everybody, but to embrace and hold that I voice, not just as it's easier in the story because we're telling it like this is my story, but in the reflections, hold it as the I too, so that you are honoring the change that is happening in you in that reflection. Does that make sense? Do you see that, Olga?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Again, that's not criticism, right? This is culture change. You'll notice the habit. I do it all the time. I'm talking about myself and I use the second person, you. What is that? Like I do that every day, all day, you know, and I'm really talking about me, me, right? Because that's the position I'm living from. So it's just again, part of this work that we do here is just that gentle noting, and we'll push and remind each other and then see how that change feels. Good hands. I'll give that back to Greg there.
Yeah, it's Chris that is next.
Thank you. I really just wanted to take a moment first and thank everybody for letting me be here. It's the previous session and this session are both very interesting to me. For today, I just wanted to really express some level of appreciation for everybody's tellings, Olga's telling, Nicola's telling, Alexander's telling, Sebastian's tellings. Your stories today have been very tactile to me, and I've really felt something from all of them, whether it's a physical sensation of actually feeling the threads of Alexander's eggs or Olga's plantain leaves, or hearing the hissing and rushing of the wind through Nicola's oats. It's been a very tactile evening for me, and I just wanted to express my appreciation and gratitude for that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chris.
Michael's got a question.
It's interesting because I share with Chris some of his comments. When I was listening to Nicola and Olga and Alexander, I too was thinking of the rich imagery that was coming across, that the images could, in a sense, become metaphor. They could become myth. I was thinking of, because I have an English background, of poetry. That the sensory experiences were very pivotal. With Sebastian, I'm going to say to you, I'm a retired teacher, and I had some similar experiences where I was supply teaching, and a student, unfortunately peed his pants, and I said, Peter, why didn't you tell me how to use the washroom? He just looked up to me with these soulful puppy eyes and said, I forgot. And the other children did not laugh at him, which was surprising, but he didn't laugh at him. They seemed to think, well, it could have happened to me too. So I'm learning something from these. I was supply teaching. It happened to be a kindergarten class. But I wanted to tell a story, if I may, Dr. Sutherland, Andy, if that's all right. I was doing a little bit of work on a horse farm. And these horses were horses that were in races. And these horses, unfortunately, were inside their stalls for most of the day. Now, I told these fellas, I worked around horses, but I'm not an old veteran. I was a high school teacher. I didn't work with horses all my life, but I love horses. Said, we want you to bring this one horse for a walk to stretch its legs. Okay, so I take the horse and I talk to him, and I got the rope, and I bring him out of the stall, and all is good. And then I move towards the barn. There's the shadowy figure with the sun coming through, and we're walking on cement, and then the feet go clippity-cloppity right onto the soft dirt. And so we're walking outside, and this horse becomes very excited that it's outside and starts becoming wanting to bounce around almost like your pet dog. And I says, oh my God. And a matter of fact, what the thing did is it reared a few times on its hind feet. And I thought, man, I'm an amateur. I'm not the horse whisperer. This thing's going to crush me. And yet somehow I tried to keep the head, the heart, and the soul in one piece because I felt I was in trouble. And I tried to talk to the horse in a soft and gentle way, and yet firm. I says, look, fella, if you're going to keep that up, we're going to have to go back in the barn. I'm not going to take any chances with you bouncing around here and crushing me with your big hooves. So I was nervous, but I tried to relax my muscles such that I was able to turn the horse around, come on back, walk him head first into the stall, bring him around to face this door. And then I felt like an incredible release of just complete relief that I had survived that. And I explained to the guys what happened, but it's like, I don't know, they must have thought, I don't know, they must have thought I had more experience than I did. I managed fine, but it's like I didn't really know what to do. I had an idea because I've ridden horses. I've worked around them a little bit, but I was just feeling, okay, what makes sense to me here? And I felt, as Andy said earlier, grateful to survive that. I just this was a big animal, and I don't know how many hands high it was, but it's quite a large beast. And it really wasn't his fault. He was cooped up inside there all day, and he wanted to move around. He hadn't been outside for a while. I don't know why he wasn't in the fields. They have their pecking order, as you know. Maybe there wasn't enough room. But all I can say is, I just feel that relief. Thank you.
I like in the telling of your story that I'm a retired teacher, so part of your story, I was relating to the horse being in the stall, and now being out of the stall. But I really liked how you said that the horse's hooves were on the concrete, and then the horse's hooves were on the ground, and that difference, of the sound and of the feeling was the thing that then got inside the horse so that it could, start to feel that pull of its wildness again, to move and to be free. I love your negotiation with it. I don't know if Lisa's listening or if she's on, but she could give you probably better insights or how she might interpret that story. She works with horses, and she's remarkable. So, yeah.
I've had the privilege of having Lisa give me some guidance with that on Dr. Sutherland's farm. So yes, I can talk for about that at some point. Thank you. Yeah.
I wish it was my farm, but we're lucky enough to have a place where we can work and be with the horses. But so let's look at that metaphor, because I think it's something that's fair for all of us. And remember, there's a design thought here at the end of this, right? I want to bring this around to the beginnings of some integration, even 2 sessions in. So right now, metaphorically, who is on concrete? Who is stuck in the stall? And or as you see it, it doesn't have to just be, it could be in your life, it could be in your family, it could be in your community, it could be as we see our stuckness in the world as a whole. But the starting notion of, what does Michael's horse have to teach us here, the horse of his story? We have this notion of confinement, of this, of this sort of hard, uniform, monotonous ground. Yeah. Who in their own life has resonated in getting stuck like that? Maybe today, maybe in this last week, in this last month. Because at the end of the day, this is important that we make this step. And we're hearing it in the stories, but I want you to take it a step further and say, how do you embody this in your life? Right? How do you embody this as a way to move? This is it. How do you embody this as a way to move differently in your life? Let me just ask again, is anybody stuck? Would they like to share their stuckness? That's a good start. Just as an initial position.
Yes, Nicolas. Then Sebastian.
Well, what really came up for me to share is the hearing that, and especially like the sound of the hooves on the cement and then onto the earth, and the feeling of like touching the earth, and like that sense of freedom. and that like sense of being like wild and free, and especially around this like underlying notion of like what is health. And I guess for me, I'm currently feeling quite free actually in my life, quite like on the earth. And there's this opportunity that I was given recently or presented with of doing some further academic study. And I'm in this position of considering this 2 years of research and study and looking deep into a topic that I'm really passionate about, but in a very focused, like reading and writing way. And that feeling to me, like, while it makes a lot of sense to do it, for me personally, that feeling of like, what would that be like is like entering back onto the cement and into a stall for my experience. And it just like kind of touched me. Like, it just kind of like I felt it more in that story, in the telling of that story. And then just in sharing, like, and that's how it felt for me, rather than like to be free. And then and the thought, I guess I'll also just say the two little stories that came up in that like freedom share with these stories that I've heard of other projects happening around. One of them is this daylighting of streams that's happening, and this process of like taking streams that are put underground into these culverts and hidden, and pavement put over top, and streets and buildings and everything built on top of them. And it's actually this process of opening them back up in places that make sense, and bringing them back into the daylight, and bringing them back into our awareness, and like revegetating the sides and making the stormwater runoff more effective, and like freeing these streams essentially. And for some reason, when Michael told the story of the horse coming out of the barn and into that field, that daylighting of the streams, like, was what it reminded me of, that freeing. So it's not exactly what you asked for with the share.
No, and it doesn't have to. I'm glad that's not exactly, but it's an interesting one. So do you have a chance to be part of that stream project as well, or is that just a project that inspired you in its notion?
It's a project that's inspired me, and that has informed some of some local work in the area. It's like a concept that's coming into the Waterloo region where I'm living right now, and being considered more. And yeah, so it's more inspired, and now it's part of a bigger conversation.
So we take that bigger conversation, and we'll create it as metaphor. So at the end of the day, and I won't go into, you'll choose to go into this academic endeavor, or you won't, and you'll go through your process of choice, and however you will, and you'll find your way through into that in the wisdom that is. And so I'm not going to comment on that, and there's no suggestion of this or that. But here's a way where we can take act to know in it. So let's go with the idea that you do choose to do it. And the reason I'm saying that is it's not to push you in that direction, but obviously there's a tension there. Like, do I not, like the freedom's lost to be more confined, again, to be restalled, to be back on concrete, from the freedom of where you're walking now. But let's put these two things together as an act to know. So let's imagine you do go back into that world of academia, these 2 years of research, this opportunity, and what it presents. Can you find a way to open up the streams in this endeavor? Like, does academia have to be closed and tight and underground, or is there a way to enter back into this world, to the reading, to the reports, to the writing, to the boundaries and confines that are there, and in still respecting that, also find a way to open it up, right? Like the stream project. And right now that's just abstraction, but that would really mean coming up with actions within that action, right? So not going back to academia as you know it, but going back to academia with a set of other new actions that you're going to progressively layer into it throughout those days. And this applies to any of us. I mean, I can look, for example, I can look towards Adam. I know this well. We're going to both go to the office tomorrow. It's the same office that we go to every day. We know the job. The teachers in the room know this too. We'll go back, they're retired so they can laugh at us. But if they weren't, they would know the classroom they were going back to, right? But in that, can we take your metaphor of opening streams? Like, how do we bring a new daylight into the classroom? How do we bring a new daylight into our physician's office? How do we bring a new daylight into these things that we think we know what they are already, but maybe we don't? That's the acting to know that we're asking you to design into your life. So if you make that choice to go back, don't stop there, right? Say today, every day that you're in it, what is a new action to create a new pattern in this old thing? But if we can't just throw out all the old things, like it's not like if we did a global burn it down, that's not working, right? And I don't think that's the wisdom of the sort of notion of acting to know, right? So, so as you're talking, I'm going to go into tomorrow to my work, and I'm going to say, how do I open up these streams? These streams that I might be underground, but we're going to let the daylight come, and maybe we'll add new contours that are more natural, and we're going to find a way to bring something to the stream, right? So what inspiration do I take of your story into my job tomorrow? What do I do differently tomorrow that I haven't done yet, with the idea that something will come? And I love the idea of streams. I don't know if you guys remember, and I've heard ponds and streams, and maybe you remember ponds and streams as a kid when you picked up pebbles and you threw rocks in, and they went kerplunk, and you had ripples. And then you threw another rock and you had the ripples of ripples. And then you threw another rock and there's all of these beautiful interference patterns and synergies and, troughs and crests and, amplifications and crashings. Right. So what am I asking? What is act to know? Act to know is simply this: throw stones into the ponds and streams of your life every day. Every day. But you got to be creative of what that stone looks like. And what are those ponds that you're throwing into? Right? This is acting to know.
I'll tell coming back around to, I told that story of the mosquito, the origins of the mosquito in my bad telling of it. But the first time I ever told that story, I told it at a camp, and I told it because there was a young man there who held his arm really high in the middle of class, and he smashed this mosquito on, with all his force, and then, sort of stopped. And that's why I told the story. And I told the story about, the point of coming to that moment of anger, actually, vengeance and all these just frustrated feelings actually resulted in an outcome which couldn't have been predicted. And so I made the connection between, killing this thing with anger in his heart. It's a nuisance. And he really held that story. And I saw him a couple of days later, and he came up to me and he said, Mr. McClure, look at my arms. He goes, I got mosquito bites all over me. And I said, oh my God, what's happening? He goes, I'm not hitting the mosquitoes anymore. I just let them bite me. And I said, oh, that wasn't the point of my story. It wasn't to just let me, it was about, just letting go of those feelings. Oh, he's like, oh, okay, all right. And a day later, a hummingbird flew into a window outside the studio and crashed on the ground in front of the studio. And he came out, and we were all marveling at this little creature and wounded. And one of the girls picked it up and had it on her finger, and everyone was was looking at this, and we were all hoping for it to be okay, and we said, put it in a branch. And this young man came up to me and said, Mr. McClure, what does that mean? Like, why did this hummingbird show up here? And like, I knew the answer. And I said, I don't know. I think in some cultures, the hummingbird comes as a messenger for spirits, sometimes from the other side. And he just, he started crying. He goes, my grandmother passed away before I came here. And I said, do you feel like maybe that was, like your grandmother letting you know that, that she's okay and that she's here, and, a little bit of, a gift for you. And he was like, yeah, I think it is, I think it is. And the moment between the standing up in class and being, big about smashing this mosquito created the impetus for me to tell that story, which created the impetus to talk about feelings and to open up about feelings. And then that just laid the ground, made the soil available, made things soft for that next moment. And that next moment then, of course, just opened up into, something else. The horse was now out of the stall in a way, and on soil or on ground where it could, have an expression. Yeah. All the stories that I always feel as if just I'm always in the presence of some great mystery. Like listening to the sound of plants in the wind. Some poetry, as Michael would say, right? Some poetry. It doesn't necessarily need to be known or framed or explained or anything else, but that expresses itself and shows itself as change. And that change is always transformative and lovely and beautiful and healing.
Sean, I saw your hand earlier.
Hi, folks.
Hey.
I'm like a stream kind of trickling in at some point in the river. I was putting my son Theo to bed, and you might have seen him there for a little bit eating his snack before bed. And listening in now to the tenor of the conversation. And forgive me, the woman who last spoke with the mortar and pestle in the background, I missed your name. I was struck by your
Nicola.
Sorry,
Nicola.
What was it? Nicola. Yes. Hi. And your situation and Bill's kind of ponderings and wonderings about how much do we know about these things, and I think, Bill, you sort of talked about acting in order to know, and that led me to a notion. I don't know if this has been introduced, but it comes from a teacher that Bill and I have, a mentor of mine and Bill's as well. And Andy, I don't know how much you've connected with him, but Bradford Keeney, who's very immersed in sort of the conversation that we're having here around complexity, speaks about prescriptions for action. That there's a medicine in creative action. And this notion that we act in order to generate difference. right? Not to achieve an outcome, but really to that it's difference itself that is what feeds the circularity of change of life, and prescriptions for action. As an educator myself, I'm sort of faced with them all of the time, and I'm an academic as well, and so this thing about concrete and the earth I've wrestled with for a long time, because it can feel very easy for myself. I mean, I've experienced being in my head too much, and the culture can kind of privilege that, keep you out of the woods, and in a book, and so what came to mind with the sunlight, the daylighting of the stream was a prescription that I sort of longed for myself of writing in a different way. I mean, I'm on my computer all day, and I mean, what if I tomorrow, and I'm thinking I'd love to do this, is to take my books and my pens and my paper and to be in the sunlight. I don't know if there's going to be sunlight tomorrow. Well, there will be. It might be cloudy, but that there's light. And what if I went into my backyard in my winter gear, and I allowed that environment of the garden with the dead leaves and the snow and the sound be the room, if you will, in which I write, in which I think, in which I read. What kind of difference might that make in what I'm paying attention to and what's coming forth through me through an activity that, academia, this is, it's lots of theory and concepts and abstractions. But what if there was something that I changed about the way in which I do my work, and might I make it interesting enough that I may be caught by the muse, I may be caught by the wind in a way that changes how I think. But maybe that's not really the point. But maybe this is a question back to the group around what kinds of prescriptions for actions are, going to give us an opportunity to create difference and not just more of the same.
I see Chris's hand there. Stealing your job, Greg. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Was it Sean who just spoke?
Yeah, it was Sean. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Because your name comes up just as C, and I wanted to make sure. I just wanted to comment your self-prescription to change the way you write. I write myself. I write fiction, the horror fiction, science fiction, scripts, things like that. Nothing academic, but it's writing nonetheless. And I have to say that when I switched from writing on a word processor to actually writing by hand in long form in notebooks with pens and paper, and I burned through, I can't even remember how many pens in the last thing that I wrote. It's such a more personal and different experience. And I would recommend definitely trying it yourself. I'm not going to say it's absolutely going to work for you in the same way that it did for me, but I found in doing it, I became more entwined with the stories that I was writing, and they became considerably more personal and more existential and more involved in my own personal experiences and my memories. And it was easier to express an emotion through the stories I was telling than it was when I was doing the same thing through a computer onto a screen in front of me. So it was a very transformative experience going back to actually physically writing on paper. And I also found out that my handwriting is atrocious.
Thank you, Chris. And again, one thing I just want to say so you don't miss with what Chris just shared, everybody, is what he just shared was textual, was texture. It was textual. There's a pun there. It wasn't just the text of writing, but the texture of pen, of ink, of paper. Something that had relational richness versus something that was relatively relationally impoverished in his experience. And I hope you heard the texture of that texture in the telling, right? I love the humblest stories, right? Here's a story about writing long form in a notepad. It's a good story, right? They're all good. Let's get a last hand in here, and then we'll do a wrap up.
Yes, Adam.
Oh, hello. I wanted to pick up on what Chris was saying because I totally concur. There is a very different thinking, feeling, and synthesis when you actually write by hand. And I think most family doctors, like myself, have had to switch from writing to typing over the past few decades, whether we like it or not. And I remember it's such a loss actually going from a paper product into electronic, even though I was the first one to transition. I remember back in medical school many years ago when in the library, there is this picture of of three things: a heart, a hand, and a head. I think it was ascribed to Osler, but I'm not sure. But basically trying to impress on young medical students that to be a good doctor, you have to bring all three together. And the funny thing is when I went back a few years ago to writing with a fountain pen, I really felt like when you take notes this way, you're bringing your head and your heart and your hand together in a way that you couldn't with the keyboard. And I find that I'm also listening to patients telling their story in a more narrative way rather than in trying to resist the way to practice modern medicine, which is really using a templated form and already having a prejudiced category of what your patient wants or needs. So anyway, that was just to say that I totally agree with Chris in his description of the writing process. Thanks.
As we go along too, I also want to, as we mature, and we don't have to run there, but as we mature as a group and as a community, I hope too in time we have space to not only agree, but also disagree. That way we find ways to dialogue and discuss. But, when you look at the root of the word discourse, it's to both be on different courses, right? Like it's to, sometimes to diverge and push. And so, I love that we are finding our agreements. And in time, I hope we all come to love that we'll find our disagreements in this holding as well, too.
I disagree with that, Bill.
Yes. Sean, I have words for you, but I'm going to write them in long form. No bullet points for you, sir. Just bad poetry. Yes. But I want to go back, Sean. I want to wrap it up with what you said with the idea of prescriptive action, a reminder to Brad's wisdom and work and cybernetic contribution. And one of the things I want to there is just a little story. I had a karate instructor in Japan. His name was Kawada Sensei. And he was said to have never ever taught the same class twice. And in the time that I lived at his dojo in Tokyo called the Hoitsukan Dojo, he never taught the same class twice. And so you can imagine a career of 40 years of teaching, in this case, karate. He had never taught the same class in a template route way. Like you're saying, Adam, the routeness of that medicine is gone. It was always tailored to the group and the day and the moment and his temperament at that time. And so, and very much, our teacher Brad was the same way in his work, in psychotherapy, which he would always work to never create the same therapy, never create the same prescription. He would always look to create a new prescription for a patient every time. And I think as we delve into this koan act to know that that's a really lovely wisdom. And I'm going to leave you with that in a prescriptive sense. Never do the same thing twice. Never prescribe the same thing twice. Never act in the same way. Always find a slightly different change, because change brings change. And it might be small and it might be large. And there is something called wise change, I think, in all of that. But I want to end with one breaking of that rule. There is one prescription in medicine, a medicine that I actually believe is universal, and it's the only one that I prescribe over and over again. But there's a little caveat, because everybody does it differently every time they do it. So even though it's the same prescription, the nature of the richness of the interaction in it holds the difference each time. And it's to go back to the story that Nicola started with us, which is the wisdom and wonderment of a garden. Everything about act to know and the richness and diversity and difference and, all of those things that it will bring forth in your life and your growth. Planting a garden is that medicine. If you want a single universal medicine that is going to bring you into health, and we're very close now, this is the time to buy your seeds. This is the time to order. Very soon they'll be out of stock. They're already out of stock of purple carrots. I know, I tried last week to get them. I like, their funky looking carrot. So here's the thing. You want to change. You want to take Heinz von Forster's advice. You want to be yourself. Plant a garden. And you will be surprised by the wonderment. You will be surprised how it changes you on every level. Not, exercise, nutrition, the diversity in your yard. You will see bugs you've never seen. You will see birds you've never seen. You will taste tastes you've never tasted. You will stretch and move in ways this body has not stretched and moved, perhaps in decades. So my one act to know prescription for all of you. And I want you to be like Johnny Appleseeds in this one. I want you, you want a great prescription, buy extra seeds so you can give this prescription to the loved ones in your life. You want to spread health, just like Johnny Appleseed spread apple seeds and grew apple trees across the land. Plant a garden and become zealots and missionaries of garden planting. This will teach you all you need to know about act to know in your lifetime. Garden for the rest of your life. Where we lived in Winnipeg, there was a great couple. It was a mother and daughter, and the mother was in her 90s and the daughter was in her 70s. And their garden was incredible. It was wild. It was feral. It was different every year. And she and they knew every square inch of it intimately. And were in wonderment of what it provided, and they shared that wonderment every year. If you want a great piece of homework, go YouTube Ruth Stout's garden. And you will see, unless they blurt it out, a 70-year-old woman gardening naked, perhaps at times in the video. That is part of Ruth's garden. But she will teach you something about acting to know through the garden. And here's the one last thing, and I'll just send it over to Andy for a wrap up. But here's the thing I want you to remember. You've got a lot already as health designers in your life, in your family's life, in your community's life, in the world. You are now armed with what is health, hold it, and act to know. And you have these two very powerful koans, prescriptions, imperatives, as Heinz von Forster would say, that will start to change your life implicitly. And And I want you now to start thinking about it as people come to you, as you come to yourself and others come to you in stuckness. Hold that question. What is health to them? What is health in them? What is health around them? What is the richness of that context that will start pointing towards those answers? And start playing with act to know. I would suggest I'm going to give one last story about the One Needle Acupuncturist. There's a story of an ancient Chinese acupuncture master who would sit at the height of his skill and the end of his life to treat every patient with only a single needle. Not 2, not 5, not 10, not 30. And we'll go through it. We'll build up all of these needles so that we find out at the end of all of this, there is only one needle. Go back to what is health. Go back to any one of these ones that resonates with you. Today, you've got act to know. Maybe that resonates. Maybe that feels right. Maybe it's not yours yet. There's others coming. So I just want to leave you with momentum today that this is the start of something is nonlinear and is indirect and is, tangential. And as I look to my own ancestry, as Irish as all of this is, in where we go and wander and wonder, right? You are on your way to understanding how to design, engage, and interact with this thing called the designing of health. And not how you're going to design it, but how it will design you. McClure, any last words?
Aye, sir. All right. I just want to say we started with this idea of difficult conversations and discomfort. We just sort of out of that initial question, we came to this point of talking about some things that were, about our discomfort. And this week we've talked about act to change and or act to know, and a lot of that has led to these conversations about change, about transformation.
Just to know Andy did a great change.
I think in a lot of time
he went from act to know to act to change. That's lovely.
Yeah, pretty good. Where was I going? Oh yeah. I think a lot of the times we sort of think about that in terms of change equals comfort, or change equals balance, or change equals stability, or change equals like some positive thing, right? This is Mind and Nature, Gregory Bateson. All receipt of information is necessarily the receipt of news limited by threshold. Differences that are too slight or too slowly presented are not perceivable. They are not food for perception. So I just leave you with the idea that sometimes shitting your pants, or the concrete, or in Bill's garden, the arrival of weeds or of bad weather or pests is actually the difference that's going to make a difference. It's the thing that is going to be the prescription. And it's not necessarily the thing that you think it is. In fact, it's often the things that come along that are disruptive and uncomfortable that present the greatest opportunities for us to step into those, whatever they are, holes. Thanks, everybody. Really wonderful seeing you again.
And I'm going to summarize everything Andy said in one word: mosquitoes.
Yes.
Act to know, such that mosquitoes may come into your life.
Yes.
So I'm going to hit the end of the recording button. Thank you, everybody. I know I want to say thank you to those that did, that offered up support and donation to the project. If you go to our website page, there's the support page, and it tells ways that can be supported. Just the really simple things in this day and age of, hitting the subscriptions on our YouTube and Facebook and all of that. That is actually, as you find out, these things are important. But the thing I really want to say that is actually the only importance, the real importance in this is getting the word out, right? Is there is nothing more important here, and it's not for this project or for this. It's not going back to my sin of pride in the beginning. It's just period in the world, right? Community building, right? Building relations, planting those gardens, having those seeds come forward, right? If you are feeling things in all of this, share it with others. Let's grow the community, and let's let the community grow us. That's the need. And really there is nothing more important than that. So, so share the enjoyment and thank you for those that do take the action to come back here for week 2 and later into, 3 and 4 and 5. And as we move along and to take the actions that, to take time off and take time away and come back again, fresh and renewed, all of that is all welcome. And so, just a way to think of it. I want to thank Greg always for being here to help, and we will increase our technical demands as we grow as a community. And but I love that you're here right from the beginning, sir. So thank you. And I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to hit the end of the record. But last week, a couple new traditions. We do stick around for a few minutes off recording. One great idea came out of the post-recording session last time. If you were here last time around, then here's a prescription. Get a bowl of Lego such that you can throw it at the screen every so often if any of us get stuck and need to change and need to act anew. Bowls of Lego, new cultural, the beginning of the new culture. Erica, I think I didn't get a chance at the beginning to say hello. I know you're a new face here, and thank you 2 hours later for still being with us, and welcome. And feel free to say hello once I hit the stop to the record, which I'm about to do right now. And anybody that wants to hang around for a few minutes, feel free to. Thank you.